I never thought I'd be the one telling this story. I wish I wasn't. But sometimes, the truth refuses to stay buried, no matter how deeply we try to hide it. Mr. Redding wasn't just a teacher. He was the teacher. The one everyone loved, the one you'd find at every school event, cheering on the kids, helping out the staff, or chatting with parents like he had all the time in the world. His classroom was the safe haven, the place we all wanted to be. Looking back now, I see how carefully he constructed that image. It wasn't real. None of it was. When I first stepped into his class, I thought I'd struck gold. He had this way of making you feel seen, like you mattered. He wasn't just teaching literature, he was shaping lives, or so it seemed. He had this charisma that pulled you in, made you trust him. You'd never guess the monster lurking beneath. But the signs were there, small things I brushed aside. The way he seemed a little too invested in certain students, how his compliments occasionally felt off. Not wrong enough to call out, just enough to leave you unsettled if you thought about it too hard. I didn't think about it. None of us did. We wanted to believe he was the hero we all saw. The first time I knew something was really wrong was when Emily Parker disappeared. She was one of the brightest students in our class. Sharp, funny, and fearless. If you ever needed someone to have your back, Emily was that person. The day she didn't show up to school, the whispers started immediately. People said she ran away, maybe got overwhelmed by college applications, or a fight with her parents. It was easy to believe at first. Teenagers can be unpredictable, but deep down, I knew Emily wasn't like that. She wouldn't just vanish without a word. And then, the rumors started pointing toward him. At first, I thought it was ridiculous. Mr. Redding? The same guy who spent his weekends organizing charity drives and chaperoning dances? No way. Except the evidence didn't care what I believed. The investigation unfolded slowly at first, like peeling back layers of paint. His behavior during those weeks struck me as strange. He wasn't frantic or worried like the rest of us. He seemed off. Too calm. Then the police showed up at his house. The details that emerged were horrific. A compartment in his garage filled with journals, obsessively detailing his twisted thoughts about Emily, and apparently others before her. Evidence that she had been in his car. Pieces of her clothing. When the news broke, I sat in silence, trying to process it. This was the same man who had smiled at us every morning, who had handed me back essays with encouraging notes scribbled in the margins. Now those same hands had blood on them. Redding confessed. I don't know if it was guilt, pressure, or some twisted need to share his story, but he admitted it all. The obsession, the planning, the moment he took her life. He talked about it like it was just another lesson plan he had crafted, something methodical and detached. Emily wasn't his first victim either. The police started connecting dots to other missing students, cases that had gone cold over the years. Some of them I remembered vaguely. Names that had faded into the background of school gossip, but now felt like weights dragging me down. He had been doing this for years, right under our noses. The trial was like something out of a nightmare. Seeing him in that courtroom, shackled and hollow-eyed, was almost worse than hearing the evidence. The betrayal cut deeper than anything. Parents wept openly. His former colleagues sat frozen, unable to reconcile the man they'd worked with for years with the monster in front of them. The jury didn't take long to convict him. Life in prison without parole. But even with that sentence, it didn't feel like justice. Emily was gone. The others were gone. Nothing could bring them back. The weeks after his conviction felt like living in a fog. No one wanted to talk about it, but it was all anyone thought about. Every teacher got side-eyed glances. Every gesture of kindness was second-guessed. I avoided the places he used to frequent, the coffee shop down the street, the park where he'd sometimes hold informal tutoring sessions. It was like his shadow hung over everything, a constant reminder of how easily we'd been fooled. Emily's family started a foundation in her name. I donated, attended the vigils, tried to do something, anything that felt like redemption. But it wasn't enough. Even now, I can't wrap my head around it. How someone could wear a mask so perfectly, fool so many people for so long. Every time I hear about a teacher inspiring students or going above and beyond, I feel this pang of suspicion, this bitter aftertaste that I can't shake. What happened with Mr. Redding didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed trust. And that's the worst part of all. He was supposed to be one of the good ones. He was supposed to make the world better. Instead, he shattered it. I'll never forget the first time I heard the name Alexander Pichushkin. It wasn't just the name itself that haunted me, but the chilling nickname he'd earned, the chessboard killer. It sounded like something from a crime novel, the kind of nickname designed to draw people in, to make the story of a murderer somehow more palatable, more marketable. But as I dug deeper into his life and crimes, I realized there was nothing palatable about what Pichushkin did. This was a man who played a game with human lives, a game he claimed was his life's work. He set out to kill 64 people, one for every square on a chessboard. To him, it wasn't murder, it was strategy. It was a goal he pursued with chilling precision, each victim nothing more than a pawn sacrificed to his sick ambition. Pichushkin was born in 1974 in Moscow. If you look at his early life, it might seem like the usual background for someone who could grow up to do something extraordinary, or in his case, extraordinarily horrific. He was described as intelligent, even charismatic at times. But there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. There's always a moment people point to when trying to understand killers like him. For Pichushkin, it was a head injury he suffered as a child. He fell from a swing, and the blow to his head was severe enough that his personality seemed to change. People say he became more withdrawn, angrier, and increasingly focused on gaining control. But even with that knowledge, it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment someone like him takes that final step toward becoming a killer. Was it the trauma of the injury? Was it something already inside him, waiting for the right conditions to surface? These questions linger in my mind, but the answers remain as unsettling as the crimes themselves. Pichushkin didn't just stumble into murder one day. His fascination with death and dominance grew slowly, quietly, until it consumed him. By the time he committed his first murder in 1992, he was already imagining how far he could take it. That first victim was someone he knew, an old classmate he lured into Bitsa Park, a sprawling, shadowy expanse on Moscow's outskirts. What struck me about this killing wasn't just the act itself, but what it revealed about Pichushkin's mindset. After pushing his victim into a well and leaving him to drown, Pichushkin walked away without a second thought. It wasn't enough for him, though. One murder might satisfy some killers, but not him. For Pichushkin, this was the opening move in a game he intended to play until he had complete control over the board. Over the years, he honed his method. Most of his victims were elderly men or homeless individuals, people he thought wouldn't be missed. He would approach them with an offer of vodka, striking up a conversation to lower their guard. Then, he would lead them to Bitsa Park, where the real game began. His method was as brutal as it was consistent. Once in the park, he would bludgeon his victims to death, often using a hammer. Sometimes, he'd leave the bottle of vodka with them, as if to mock their last moments. I've read accounts of how he justified his actions, how he believed he was giving his victims a form of release, freeing them from lives of misery. But when you look at the sheer violence of his crimes, it's clear there was no mercy in what he did. He wasn't freeing anyone. He was taking pleasure in their pain, in the power he held over them in those final moments. What chills me most is how methodical he was. After each murder, he'd mark his progress on a chessboard. He wasn't killing out of rage or impulse. He was doing it to fulfill a goal he'd set for himself. Each life he took was just another square crossed off, another step closer to the twisted sense of accomplishment he craved. For years, Pichushkin operated in the shadows. The police had no idea a serial killer was stalking Bitsa Park. It wasn't until 2006 that his killing spree came to an end, and even then, it was almost by chance. One of his victims, a woman named Marina Moskaliova, had told her son where she was going before meeting Pichushkin. She left a note with his phone number, a small but crucial detail that ultimately led to his capture. When police arrested him, they found his chessboard with 61 squares marked. He was just 3 kills away from his ultimate goal. Pichushkin's confession was chilling. He didn't just admit to the murders, he boasted about them. He described his methods in cold, detached detail, as if he were recounting a mundane task rather than the systematic slaughter of dozens of people. What struck me most was his lack of remorse. During his trial, he spoke about his crimes with a kind of pride, that even regret, not for the lives he'd taken, but for the fact that he hadn't completed his chessboard. He saw himself as superior to other killers, someone who deserved recognition for his work. Pichushkin was convicted of 48 murders, though he claimed responsibility for at least 61. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. But even that doesn't feel like justice. How do you punish someone who sees themselves as above morality, as beyond human? The chessboard killer's story isn't just a tale of one man's monstrosity. It's a reminder of the fragility of life, of how easily trust can be manipulated and exploited. His victims were ordinary people, lured into a deadly game they didn't even know they were playing. I think about those victims often. They weren't just names on a list or numbers on a chessboard. They were people with lives, with families and friends who never got to say goodbye. Their stories deserve to be remembered, even if Pichushkin himself doesn't. As I write this, I can't help but wonder what separates someone like Pichushkin from the rest of us. Is it a question of nature versus nurture? A matter of circumstance, or something deeper, something inherently broken? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. What I do know is that the story of Alexander Pichushkin has left an indelible mark on me. It's a story of calculated cruelty, of a man who turned murder into a game and saw himself as its ultimate player. In the end, the chessboard killer didn't win. He was caught, his game cut short before he could complete his board. But the scars he left behind, on his victims, their families, and anyone who's ever heard his story, will remain. And that, perhaps, is his true legacy. A chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human soul. I never expected to stumble upon the threads of a decade-long masterpiece in human destruction. What I uncovered wasn't merely a series of murders, but a chilling, methodical operation that defied every instinct I thought I had about crime and its motives. When you look at it from the outside, it almost feels like art. Meticulously crafted, flawless in execution. But knowing what I know now, the art was soaked in blood, and its creator was the kind of person who thrives in the shadows, thriving on patience and precision. This is my account of unraveling the story of the patient planner. A killer who spent 10 years orchestrating what could only be described as the perfect string of murders. The first time I came across the case, it wasn't even a case yet. It was a whispered story at a coffee shop, a friend of a friend who knew someone who died under strange circumstances. An accident, they said, a freak set of events that led to a man falling down the stairs in his own home. It wasn't a crime, nobody even thought it was. But for some reason, the story stuck with me. Looking back, maybe it was the way they described it. He was so careful, always checking the stairs, and yet he tripped. It doesn't make sense. A small detail easily ignored. And I did. For years I pushed it aside, chalking it up to life's unpredictability. It wasn't until much later, after I had become deeply entrenched in crime research and true crime writing, that I stumbled on another case. This one wasn't a staircase fall. It was a house fire. A middle-aged woman, living alone, caught in her sleep as her house burned to the ground. The fire report ruled it an accident. Faulty wiring, they said. But something about it felt familiar. I didn't know why, but I began digging into these cases, not just the fire and the fall, but others that seemed eerily similar. One by one they appeared. A drowning in a quiet lake, a carbon monoxide leak in a suburban home, a hit and run with no witnesses. Each incident seemed ordinary at first glance, but the deeper I looked, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't until I charted the dates and locations that I realized how meticulously these deaths had been spaced out. Years passed between some of them, and they occurred in different states, sometimes even different countries. The randomness of it all was its brilliance. Every death was an isolated event, leaving no immediate reason to connect them. Police reports filed away as accidents, no suspects, no patterns, and that was the genius of it. This wasn't someone acting out of impulse or rage. This was someone with the patience of a chess master, thinking moves ahead while the rest of the world remained blind to the game. What chilled me the most was that this person didn't rely on the usual tropes of serial killers. There were no trophies taken, no cryptic messages left behind. This wasn't about ego or taunting law enforcement. It was about control. Each murder was a display of domination over chaos, a cold declaration that life could be manipulated like a puppet on strings. I couldn't help but admire the intellect behind it, even as it made my stomach churn. The planner had spent years learning how to blend into the background, how to study their targets, and how to create scenarios that would fool even the sharpest detectives. As I dove deeper into the evidence, or lack thereof, it became clear that this person wasn't merely a killer. They were a student of their craft. Forensic science, psychology, police procedure, they had studied it all. Every step they took was calculated to perfection. The victims were chosen carefully. There was no common thread of appearance, age, or occupation. Each one seemed plucked from obscurity. What they did share, however, was a life that made them easy to isolate. Single, estranged from family, or living in situations where an accident wouldn't seem implausible. And then there were the methods. This was no ordinary killer, no knife-wielding maniac leaving bloodstains behind. Their tools were subtlety and time. They used the natural chaos of life to cover their tracks. A misplaced step on a staircase, a faulty gas line, a snapped brake cable. These weren't murders that screamed foul play. They whispered it so faintly that no one listened. But there was one thing the patient planner didn't anticipate: me. It started innocently enough, as curiosity often does. But the more I dug, the more I felt consumed by the need to understand. How could someone operate in plain sight for so long without leaving a trail? How could they perfect something as inherently messy as murder? I began reaching out to families, sifting through obituaries, piecing together the lives of the victims. At first, I thought the planner must have had some personal vendetta, but there was no connection between them. These weren't revenge killings or crimes of passion. The planner didn't care about who the victims were. They cared about what they represented. To them, these people were pieces on a chessboard, their deaths a way to test their theories, refine their methods, and ultimately prove that perfection was possible. After years of research, I finally found something. It wasn't much, just a single thread that hadn't been tied off. A witness who, at the time, had dismissed their observations as unimportant. A neighbor who had seen a figure lingering near the house of one victim just days before the accident. They hadn't reported it because nothing seemed out of place. This small lead led to another. A surveillance camera that had captured a shadowy figure walking away from the scene of another death. The footage was grainy, useless in identifying anyone, but it was enough to confirm what I had long suspected. The planner wasn't perfect. They were close, yes, but even they couldn't account for every variable. It's hard to describe how it feels to confront the work of someone like this. There's a certain awe that comes with seeing the scale of their planning, the level of intelligence required to pull it off. But that awe is quickly swallowed by a deep, unsettling fear. This wasn't just murder. This was the calculated dismantling of lives, done with the precision of a surgeon and the apathy of a machine. The planner's brilliance was undeniable, but so was their cruelty. They didn't see their victims as people, only as problems to solve, obstacles to overcome. Even now, as I write this, I wonder how many more like them are out there. How many patient planners are watching, waiting, perfecting their methods before they strike again? The case remains a haunting reminder that some killers don't need bloodstains or confessions to leave their mark. Sometimes, all they need is time, patience, and the chilling belief that perfection is within their grasp. And for 10 long years, the patient planner proved that it was.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.